Have to go to our next intervener, which is Mr. Blaikie for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start by reassuring Mr. Drouin that one of the reasons this hasn't come up in Ontario is that notwithstanding the fact that it's pointed to as an example of what the government here would like to do, there is no central budget implementation vote in Ontario. And if you'd like to refer to the various votes that are posted online, I'd be happy to share that URL. So I mean, for as much as they do coordinate between finance and the Treasury Board, they didn't opt for one kind of omnibus vote as the way to bring about that alignment. It seems to me, and you let me know if you think I'm being unfair, Mr. Pagan, that the job of Treasury Board is to provide accountability, and they do that through their challenge function. So when departments come to them and say, hey, this is more or less what we want to do, this is how we plan to do it, Treasury Board pushes back and says, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? This might be a better way. Have you tried this or thought about that? And that's where the accountability lies. Is that a pretty fair assessment of how Treasury Board works?
The Treasury Board process is very much designed to ensure accountability for the funds allocated, and so there is a very rigorous due diligence process where we seek to understand the modalities of program implementation, partners that you're working with.
And departments likely perform better, I think, as a result of that challenge, right? It helps them. It's important to their internal process. And it provides some meaningful accountability after the fact because they demonstrate what they're committed to. Now, when it comes to Parliament, you've said that Parliament should be satisfied with getting information about how departments spend money after the fact, and that doesn't inhibit the accountability function of Parliament in any way. If departments were to come to Treasury Board and say, approve the money up front, we'll go away, we'll prepare a plan, and we'll let you know how we spent the money after we spent it. But don't worry, we'll give you lots of detail. Do you think the Treasury Board could do its accountability function if it only got information retrospectively? Or do you think that it's part and parcel of the notion of accountability that some of that work be done beforehand, and that the person meant to hold someone accountable for funding has an obligation to ask questions and evaluate the answers, which presumes the answers exist, prior to granting that approval?
Just to be clear, Mr. Blaikie, what I said is that the purpose of the estimates is to provide information so that parliamentarians can hold the government to account. Parliament does not approve individual projects the way the Treasury Board does.
But surely, Mr. Pagan, surely we're talking about $54 million to the Canada Border Services agencies under these estimates. Well, under vote 40. It's considerably more under their estimates, but under vote 40.
Right.
Do you think it doesn't matter to parliamentarians whether that money is going to be used to hire more staff, buy more guns, or build a wall?
I think that those are very important questions, and parliamentarians now have the ability to ask the department involved just how they propose.
Do you think it's satisfactory that we would get that information after the money is already spent?
Well, in fact, the process of the estimates process is very much built around that fundamental architecture.
Does the leverage for Treasury Board with other departments not come from the fact that Treasury Board can withhold approval if they don't like the details of a program?
I believe that there's definitely value to departments and to the public service by Treasury Board exercising.
And why should Parliament be expected to hold the government to account without similar leverage? And is not the purpose of government voting on these funds the fact that, and notwithstanding the fact we're in a majority government right now, so granted, it's unlikely that this Parliament would refuse this government those funds. It may happen, it could happen if you have a good process. Doesn't mean it will happen. But in other situations where the government doesn't have a majority, presumably this kind of information would be very valuable to parliamentarians who do have the opportunity to deny certain funding to government.
Right. Mr. Blaikie, I take the point. I understand your concern, but what you're talking about goes to the heart of responsible government. The fact that the executive takes decisions to deliver programs and services to Canadians, and Parliament's role is to hold the government to account for that. And so, by definition, by nature, the decisions are taken by the executive, and they are necessarily provided
under
to Parliament.
Under the system of responsible government, government has an obligation to make the case for Parliament that what they're planning to do with taxpayers' money makes sense. And on the basis of those answers, Parliament either approves or rejects proposals for funding. Right. That's why government comes to Parliament to ask for the money. So on your notion of accountability, the picture that you're painting is that somehow Parliament is meant to hold government to account without any leverage, and that it's immaterial to parliamentary accountability how it is the government intends to implement a high-level goal. So if the high-level goal is supporting the Canadian Border Services Agency, there's a number of ways that you could do that. And it makes perfect sense that Parliament might approve of some ways and not approve of other ways. And the point about Vote 40 is that we're now being asked to approve that funding without knowing the way in which the government intends to pursue that high-level goal. Do you not agree that there's a problem in the basic notion of accountability that represents?
Respectfully, Mr. Blaikie, I would disagree.
Well, you would not adopt that model of accountability for Treasury Board. You would not say that it is adequate for Treasury Board to be told retrospectively by departments after the money was spent what they did with it, and that Treasury Board could somehow do its accountability function after the fact, because then they could have a nice conversation with them about how poorly they did, instead of having the conversation in advance saying, whoa, where you're going doesn't make sense, put the brakes on, you can't have the money until you come back with a better answer. And respectfully, there is a role of Parliament to do that.
Mr. Blaikie,
Parliament isn't here just to sign a blank check to the government and then criticize them after the fact. If Parliament's going to be a meaningful place, it's a place where parliamentarians should get answers from government on what they plan to do with the money before the approval is granted. That actually means that some of this conversation can benefit the development of those programs and where they go. And I take your point that we don't need to be involved in the minutiae of the delivery detail. But if our accountability function is to make any sense at all, it can't be the case that it's only retroactive, because we can't take the money back after the fact. Once it's spent, just as Treasury Board can't take the money back after the fact, which is why Treasury Board would never accept the proposition that somehow it could do its accountability function only retroactively.
I'd like to make a response, and I'm quite confident you'll have that opportunity with one of the government's questions too.